For the best aerospace era, this is Mansplaining. Here's the host, Anthony L. Seeley.
Iwo Jima, August 14th, 1945. U.S. forces have continued their relentless bombing raids on the stubborn Japanese Empire. They refuse to surrender. On the eve of yet another attack, at the briefing for the 78th Fighter Squadron, pilot Phil Schlamberg leaned in next to his friend, Captain Jerry Yellin, and said, "If I go on this mission, Captain, I'm not coming back." Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. If you are listening to this episode right now in August 2025, then it's the 80th anniversary of the Japanese surrender and the end of mankind's largest and deadliest conflicts. Great Britain, Russia, France, Germany, Italy, China, Japan, and many other countries around the world are commemorating this event in their own ways. Just as we are here today, celebrating and remembering those who made this victory possible. I thought this would be a perfect time to tell you the story of the men who flew the last combat mission of World War II. Their story is remembered by P-51 fighter pilot Captain Jerry Yellin. His name will sound familiar to those who have listened to episode 6 of the first Mansplaining 7 series, Why the Shinden Was Made. Let's get into it. Jerry Yellin was born on February 15th, 1924. He was from Hillside, New Jersey. One day growing up, he found swastikas painted on the garage of his house. He came from a Jewish family, although they were not devout in their ways of life. It did not attend service. Yellin was an athlete. He played second base in baseball and was a quarterback on the football team. He never understood the Jewish hate he received, but maybe it was just an excuse to hate him because of his success on the field. He joined the Army just as thousands of others had in the wake of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Yellin, at 21 years old, was selected to be a fighter pilot. He would fly the awesome P-51 Mustang D fighter. He was assigned to the 78th Fighter Squadron in the Pacific Theater of World War II. To achieve all-out victory over the Japanese Empire, avenge the men and women who were lost at Pearl Harbor, and end this terrible world conflict, the U.S. needed a plan, and a good one. The U.S. Navy, thanks in part to fearless dive bomber pilots like Richard Best, fought and destroyed Japanese aircraft carriers in the Pacific, particularly at the Battle at Midway. Marines were deployed to many strategic Pacific islands to fight the devout and deadly Japanese forces. Mainland Japan and Tokyo was the ultimate target. As a prelude to the ground invasion, U.S. forces needed to gain air superiority over the mainland Japan and destroy strategic targets. The P-51 Mustang fighters could not escort the B-29 bombers from the Marinara Islands to Japan and make it back. Another strategic island would be needed to stage the fighters. Iwo Jima, a small island about halfway between Japanese mainland and the air bases in the Marinara Islands, was selected. In early March 1945, Captain Yellin arrived at a 5-star resort and hotel on Iwo Jima. No, wait, that's not right. He and the 78th Fighter Squadron landed in a war zone. A year earlier, in February 1944, B-24 and B-25 bombers began raids on Iwo Jima. The bombardment lasted months until U.S. Marines landed in February 1945. The vegetation of the volcanic island was blown and burned off. Some of the Marines described the island as a large gray pork chop. Yellin and the 78th first saw the 555-foot gray mount of Mount Suribachi on the blue horizon. The pilots did a flyby of the U.S. beachhead to see where they'd be landing. They landed on a strip built by the Japanese forces that the U.S. Marines had just recently secured. Marines had only invaded 16 days prior. Only the southern third of the island was under U.S. control. After landing, Captain Yellin was ordered to get out of his plane, keep his head down, and dig a foxhole and sleep. Sounds of shouting, gunfire, and explosions were everywhere. It was hot, it was loud, it smelled. Death was everywhere. There were enemy bodies piled up beside the runway nearby. How could anyone sleep in these conditions? Could you? After a few days, the island was deemed secure, and most of the Marines moved on. Construction on 2 more runways by the Navy Seabees began because more fighter groups were expected. This was a grave miscalculation. On the morning of March 26, at 0400 hours, hundreds of Japanese forces hiding in tunnels emerged on a suicide attack known as Banzai, because that's what they yelled as they attacked. They threw grenades in tents. Some used knives and even swords. They could not retake the island, but they could go down fighting and die for the Empire. The pilots only had their standard issue 1911 sidearm to defend themselves. Now, as awesome of a gun as a 1911 is, you'd probably want something with more rounds and some more firepower in this situation. A few pilots bartered for the Grand rifles from the Marines before they left, just in case they would need them. And now they did. If you have seen the HBO miniseries The Pacific, released in 2010, then you can get an idea or an image in your head of what it looked like for those on Iwo Jima as the Japanese attacked. The combined forces of Army ground personnel, the pilots, the Navy Seabees, and the last remaining few Marines were able to stave off the attack after 5 hours. As a result of the attack, 44 command staff, along with 11 pilots, were killed, and over 100 more were injured. This Banzai attack created chaos that morning, but it would not stop the U.S. forces' plan. Early in the morning of April 7th, 1945, 300 B-29s took off from Saipan in the Marinara Islands, bound for Japan. Later that morning, Captain Yellin, along with his fighter group of over 100 P-51s and a few P-61 fighters, would take off from Iwo Jima and rendezvous with the B-29s. Every aircraft played an important role. The few P-61 fighters would provide radar and navigation for the P-51 fighter squadrons. The P-51 fighters would escort and protect the B-29 bombers during their bombing raids over targets in Tokyo. The B-29s would be the prime target for the Japanese interceptors, as well as anti-aircraft guns on the ground. This would have been an awesome sight to see all those aircrafts in formation, unless you were on the Japanese side. Captain Yellin was instructed to keep Mount Fuji and his 50 caliber gun sights of his P-51 that he nicknamed Dory R after his love interest back home. He hoped to see her again if he survived this mission. He met her in Orange County, California, while he was on leave at the Santa Ana Army Base training to be a fighter pilot. Doran Rosen was glamorous, beautiful, and had a very slim build, with long flowing hair and long legs. She obviously made quite an impression on Yellin. He and the Armada encountered their first enemy fighter, a Ki-44 Shaki known as Tojo, the first of many enemy aircrafts that they would face. As they crossed Sagami Bay, they approached the city. Anti-aircraft fire increased. The B-29's target was an industrial complex that included an aircraft engine factory. Captain Yellin described the scene. I saw little dots of light spring from the ground as the bombs exploded. Wave after wave of bombers dropped their cargo inside the squares of fire on the ground. We fighter pilots were in constant state of alert. Japanese fighters were all over the sky, and the aerial battles between us were fierce. He went on to say, when I had a chance to look down, I could see fire raging. All of the city, it seemed, was on fire. Captain Yellin and the 78th did everything they could to protect the B-29s, but the Japanese pilots were determined to destroy as many as they could. Captain Yellin said, I saw one of our B-29s get hit, and the right wing fell off. The plane burst into flames. One parachute came out, then the second, and the third. Then the huge lumbering plane keeled over. Of the 12 crew members on board, only 3 had bailed out. As the Japanese Empire did not treat their POWs humanely whatsoever, one has to wonder what happened to those 3 men that bailed out. Once back at Iwo Jima, Captain Yellin and the other pilots received their post-mission briefing. The reports were positive. The 78th, remarkably, did not lose anyone from their squadron, and of the 100 B-29s they escorted, only 3 were lost. For the Japanese, 21 fighters were taken out of the sky, trying to intercept and stop the attack on Tokyo. This mission was only the beginning. The ultimate goal was to cripple the Japanese forces as much as possible before a large-scale invasion of the mainland could take place, much like the invasion of Normandy in Europe in D-Day. The next mission did not go near as smooth for the 78th. Yellin lost several of his squadron mates to the formidable anti-aircraft firing solution from the ground and the awesome Japanese interceptors in the air. Captain Yellin lost count of how many missions he flew, either escorting B-29s over Tokyo or strafing missions on many small islands that the Japanese occupied. One mission Captain Yellin had was with a wingman named First Lieutenant Danny Mathis Jr. He and 101 other fighters came across a storm en route to Tokyo. The squadron, guided by a B 29 for navigation, decided to fly under the storm. They met up with a squadron of 450 B 29 bombers that also flew through weather to reach the coast of Japan. Their target? A naval arsenal. It's hard to imagine the scale of this many airplanes in formation flying towards a target. As the B 29 started their run, a Mitsubishi A6M known as Zero penetrated the patrols and threatened the raiding bombers. Captain Yellin jolted his stick to follow, along with his wingman, Mathis. He fired streams of 6 50 caliber guns, shouted by Mathis. The deadly Japanese fighter billowed smoke and spun down. Their first kill. In just 1 hour and 9 minutes of aerial maelstrom of fighters and bombers shooting at each other, 42% of the city was destroyed. The numbers after the mission: 3 Mustangs were shot down and 2 pilots were missing in action. The Japanese had lost at least 26 fighters and possibly more. For the proud Japanese, these numbers were very different than anything they had experienced in the previous decades of dominating the air. Early on in World War II, the Japanese had a kill ratio of 12 to 1. Nothing seemed to waver the Japanese resolve, however. Not after their allies, Italy and Germany, fell. Not after the B 29, Enola Gay, or Boxcar dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nothing. This brings us back to Iwo Jima, August 14th, 1945. At a briefing for the 78th Fighter Squadron, P-51 fighter pilot Phil Schlamberg leaned into his friend and captain Jerry Yellin and quietly said, "If I go on this mission, Captain, I'm not coming back." "What are you talking about, Phil?" Yellin asked. Schlamberg casually replied, "The feeling that I have." Was this a premonition? Stress from war? What we now call PTSD? I believe at the time they commonly called this shell shock or war fatigue. Or was it simply a loss of confidence by Schlamberg? Captain Yellin knew that confidence was paramount for the pilots in the 78th Fighter Squadron. There was, however, a delicate balance. Yellin says, "There are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots." Yellin tried to talk Schlamberg out of flying the next mission, which was scheduled for the next day, August 15th. "No, I'm going to fly the mission," he said. Phil Schlamberg was also from a Jewish family. He was the youngest of 10 siblings, born in Manhattan, New York. He grew up on the poor side of town in Coney Island, Brooklyn. He was smart and graduated with honors from high school. The Schlamberg family cannot afford college, so he decided to join the Army Air Force, as his older brothers had before. Schlamberg's IQ and Army aptitude test results were among the highest in the U.S. military. Keep in mind of how large the U.S. military was at the height of World War II. With these scores, he could choose whatever occupation he wanted in the Army. Schlamberg chose to be a fighter pilot. On the morning of August 15th, 1945, before they took off Yellin said to Schlamberg, who would be his wingman on this mission. "Whatever you do, just stay tight on my wing today. You'll be okay. And remember, if we hear the broadcast Utah, then the war's over and we can come home. Got it?" The 78th approached the now familiar Mount Fuji in their gun sights. They flew in the four-finger formation, which consisted of 4 fighters. The 4 together is known as a flight. If you extend just your 4 fingers straight out on your right hand, at the nail of your middle finger is the position of the flight leader, whose role was to lead the flight in an attack. The nail on the index finger is the flight leader's wingman, responsible for defending the left area and to the rear. The tip of the ring finger is the element leader. Their role is to follow the flight leader in an attack and aim and fire as the lead does. The nail on the pinky is the element leader's wingman, who defends the right area and to the rear. They are designated with a color like red or green and can be assigned to escort and defend B-29 bombers, or can be grouped together with other flights to form a squadron and perform strafing missions on their own. Their flight approached mainland Japan. The Utah broadcast never came, so the mission was on. They released their external fuel tanks and prepared themselves for yet another raid on Japan. Yellin and Schlamberg's flight made their strafing runs on Japanese targets while facing fierce anti-aircraft fire. After hitting an airfield, one of the pilots radioed that he was at the 90-gallon mark, which was the amount of fuel a P-51 Mustang needed to make it back to Iwo Jima. It was time to get out and away from the ever-threatening anti-aircraft guns. The 4 Mustangs made for the coast, led by Yellin. They were headed to rendezvous with one of the P-61s or P-29s that remained in a holding pattern off the coast. These aircrafts are equipped with radar and tracking systems that would guide them back to Iwo Jima. In the four-finger formation, the P-51s climbed to 7,000 feet and into some clouds for cover from the ground fire. Yellin looked over his left shoulder for his wingman and friend. Only 3 Mustangs emerged from the other side of the clouds. Phil Schlamberg was gone. He was only 19 years old. He had just lost another of his close friends. After landing, Yellin noticed the mood on the dreaded island was much different. The ground personnel were ecstatic. Emperor Hirohito had radioed the surrender of the Japanese Empire. The 78th did not receive the news until hours later, which is why they never received the Utah broadcast. World War II was finally over. Phil Schlamberg was the last American to lose his life in the air in a combat mission during World War II. Schlamberg could have used the GI Bill to go to college, meet a girl, have a family. Maybe he could have applied his intellect to further his career in aviation after the war. If only the 78th Squadron had received the broadcast of the Japanese surrender in time, before the mission. Or has Schlamberg survived the mission? Who knows what he could have achieved? This episode is for him. Now as for Jerry Yellin, He was not able to find Dory and marry her after the war. He met a woman named Helen, and their marriage lasted 65 years until her death in 2015. Interestingly, one of his sons married a Japanese girl who was the daughter of a kamikaze pilot, and they moved and lived in Japan. Now, on March 31st, 2015, Jerry Yellin, despite his advanced age, still had a sound mind and relatively decent health, returned to Iwo Jima 70 years later. Imagine what was going through his mind as he stood there on that small island, surrounded by the vast Pacific Ocean once again. Could he still hear the sound of the piston engine of his P-51? The screams of the Japanese during the Banzai attack? The voices of the 5,931 Marines who were killed in the battle to secure the island? The voices of his squadron mates of the 78th Fighter Squadron, namely Phil Schlamberg? Remarkably, he was able to return after all these years and honor them one last time. There is a video on the internet where Yellin is interviewed on Iwo Jima in 2015. He seems very sharp despite his advanced age. He gave them all one final salute. Jerry Yellin passed away on December 21st, 2017, at the age of 93. I highly recommend you read his book, The Last Fighter Pilot, by Don Brown and Captain Jerry Yellin. Now, 80 years later, whether it's at a Major League Baseball game, or a college football game, or alone in your backyard, let's take a moment to remember and honor those men and women who died in the air during World War II. And just one more thing about Phil Schlamberg. He is actually the great uncle of actress Scarlett Johansson. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, there's always a light at the end of the runway.
Follow Mansplaining for more stories from the best aerospace era, or go to bestaerospaceera.com or find us on social media.